Thank you. All right, going after lunch is always hard, so I like to always have an incentive for participation, so I'll be asking questions. So we do make the first regenerative bourbon, so make sure you stay awake. I'll ask a question. We'll send you a bottle of bourbon if you get it right. So you heard Lance talk, and you heard RJ talk, and really there's nothing more for me to say, so does anybody have any questions? All right, y'all are good and awake. Here we go. So this is where we call home. We're from the western part of North Carolina. We're about an hour above Charlotte and about an hour and a half below Asheville. That's worked out really good for our farm. We have done quite a bit of vertical integration. We'll talk about it a little bit. But to give you my background, I was a full-time fireman. For 12 years, I volunteered for 15. When I was at the fire department, it gave me my days off I kind of took the leap and went into farming. I borrowed a whole bunch of money. I can't believe anybody gave me that much. Neither could my parents. But where I got my start in agriculture was my grandfather. He worked a mill job, third shift, and then during the days, we would raise probably 10, 15 beef cows. And we also made hay. He introduced me to livestock at a young age. We started with goats, and then about the time I hit about 10 or 11, my Christmas and birthday presents were typically small calves that I could raise out with his herd, learn some animal husbandry. And so we went from this, and now we're here today. So we all know there's a fertilizer issue. We've really put a pencil to understanding nutrient cycling, how nutrients work on our farm. It really has been crazy in the last year to see how dependent we are on the amount of fertilizer that we have to import from other countries, and to just see, a 300, 400% increase. So this is where we're at today as well. Man, we're doing good for after lunch. Y'all must have not ate much. I always like to throw memes in there. When I was a fire instructor, firemen have essentially the amount of time you have with a fireman before you lose them is about 15 minutes. That's about how long an air bottle works. So typically I throw these in about 15 minutes apart to make sure you laugh and you're not asleep on me. So this is where we started at. We leased our first 30 acres in 2011 to be able to plant in 2012. That was our first crop year. And I went to our soil and water district office. We had winter erosion and winter weeds. And this NRCS agent was across the hallway. He was about my age. His name was Lee Holcomb. And I called him the friendly cover crop drug dealer because he poked his head out of the hallway and he's like, "Hey man, can I tell you about cover crops?" And he showed me this 30-minute video called Undercover Farmers that showed farmers in North Carolina, David Brandt in Ohio, all the way to Jay Fuhrer and Gabe Brown up in North Dakota. And even though these people implemented these practices in different ways, they were all trying to achieve the same goal. And it really gave us the confidence to really try these on our farm. So this is our first mistake. We planted a 7-way cover crop blend at 100% of the seeding rate of all 7 covers. We don't have failures, we have learning opportunities on the farm. I think we sprayed this one field like 3 times that spring because I learned that Germoxone kills small grain really good, but annual ryegrass will grow out of it with a vengeance. So then a lot of life lessons. But this gave me anxiety. I mean, you can see in the picture, it's knee-high on me. I'd never established a crop in a cover crop before. All my neighbors said it was going to fail. We thought it was going to fail until we actually got the crop in and saw something come out of the ground. That was a big relief. But one of the things I will say about working with Lee is he told me about check strips. It doesn't matter if it's a cover crop blend, if it's a nutrient study we're doing with different crops, if we're doing fertilizer recommendations, we always do a check strip. Those check strips have paid off massively for our operation, and this is one of them. You heard Lance talk about it earlier. We do nutrient testing on our cover crops, and so we'll cut 2 foot by 4 foot. It's just the way that we do it based on the NRCS protocol. We know how many square feet are in that sample. We can send it to Waters Lab, NCDA. We now send it to Lance because we get a faster turnaround, and I do like the way that the information's put together better. But it's a way for us to take what that cover crop actually produced, what's in the biomass, and what nutrients we can then take a calculation for. Balance your carbon to nitrogen ratios. Like Lee said earlier, we started with like 30 pounds of cereal rye. Well, maybe it's better if we put more. So then we did 60. Well, that worked out pretty good. So then we put out 120, and it's this tall, and the corn got dinged about 40 to 50 bushels per acre. And we didn't understand that that carbon to nitrogen ratio, that 80 to 1 or 100 to 1, in that amount of cereal rye would tie up nitrogen for about a year and a half. So what we have found on our farm and in our climate is about a 40 to 1. If I send off our residue and we get about a 40 to 1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, that's kind of the sweet spot in the south where I'm at. Some of the farmers that we work with up in Ohio, they're about 30 or 35 to 1. If you start moving, I would guess even further up in Michigan in a cooler situation, you would probably be down to about 20 to 1. So not only can we terminate the cover crop earlier, like Lance was saying, that 3-4 inch tall cover, if that's what we have to do, but you can also balance that with legumes in your mix and put crimson clover, winter peas. There's multiple different ways that we can do this. So we cut our biomass sample, and we take a wet weight, and we also do a dry weight. You don't have to do this if you send this to Lance's lab. One of the ways that NRCS says that you can do this is you can put it in an oven at 350 degrees for a certain amount of time. Lee did that, and he almost got divorced because of the smell. We don't do that or recommend that. But this is just the way that we do it on the farm. And so here's kind of progression. Nobody has ever said that North Carolina has ice cream soils, but the picture on your left here is where our farm started. Typically we pick up ground that was either heavy tillage with tobacco, or other farmers simply walk away from it. They'll mine the ground to the point where it doesn't produce a viable crop. They walk away from it, and then we pretty much reclaim it. On the right hand side here, you can see that's a 16-inch sample, and so about 8 inches down you can see where it goes from like a darker color to that more orange reddish clay type that we have on this particular farm. But we've seen carbon come into the system at least about an inch in depth per year that we continue to do our practices. But the big thing that we like to push is when we look at the Haney test as a farmer, I look at what we call the biological indicators. So we look at CO2 respiration, and then we look at the WEOC, which is the food source for the biology, and we've seen some pretty massive increases on our farm. And this is what we look like this last year. This was the 2021 season. Essentially, we've taken a dark red dead planting medium, and we've turned it almost into like a chocolate cake looking type soil, which is pretty good for our area. And then we also set our baseline. Ray Archuleta came out to the farm. We were part of a study with David Montgomery. We did earthworm counts, infiltration test. We did nutrient density on our crops versus our conventional neighbors, which we found very specific vitamins, minerals, differences between our crops and theirs. I think it was about 22 to 50% more nutrient dense where we were in these regenerative soil systems versus our conventional neighbors. If you haven't done these on your farm, try them out. Start setting your baseline now and giving yourself an indicator for you to work against. And then, farming really has been fun for me. Starting with 30 acres and slowly adding land over a long term of years, it really gave me the benefit of having some time off to really meet some cool people. This is Ray Stiers on the left. Sarah, his wife, is on the right, and Archuleta's in the middle. And Ray became a pretty good friend. He actually reminded me a lot of my grandpa. And so Ray and Sarah operated a farm with stalker steers. They also grew crops. Ray got in bad health one year and asked me to help him come plant his corn crop. I had never used a plate planter before. So the night before, stayed up all night looking on Google, how much talc do we put in here? What meters do we use for different seed sizes? I get out there, and this corn planter is about 10 years older than I am.
Or 20.
Yeah, or 20. Depends. It's a 50-60 model. I don't know what years they were made, but they're pretty old. So what Ray did is he would plant summer cover crop here, where the corn planter's at now, and then a winter cover crop to plant his corn into, And then these other strips where you see oats and clover, that's where the corn was the previous year, and he would just go back between the strips. One he would harvest for hay for the cattle, the other one he planted crops on. And so we're out here planting this corn crop, and I'm riding on the back, and I'm talking to Ray, and I noticed something about his planter, so I took these pictures. And if you notice, one down pressure spring, broken, one down pressure spring. The other 2 row units didn't have down pressure springs at all. And I was like, hey, Ray, did you know your down pressure spring's broken? He said, yeah. I said, man, when did that happen? He said, I don't know, sometime back in the 80s. I had just dropped $30,000 on VSET, V-Drive, Delta Downforce, Gen 2 2020 monitors, and in-furrow fertilizer on my planter, and he's making 150 bushel corn, which is about 50 bushels better than his county average with this. That was kind of a kick. So don't get hung up. It's not all about the equipment. Equipment is fun, and it is a security blanket. It is, at least for me, but you don't have to have that. And that reminds me of what my grandpa said, life's harder, it's harder if you're stupid. It seems like all the money we spend on the farm is always a direct fault of our own. So we try to keep this little quote in mind whenever it comes time to pencil out our crop. So start with the basics. Like I said before, carbon to nitrogen ratios. The big key is down here at the bottom, build diversity with experience. Don't start out with a 7-way or 12-way or 17-way blend because you hear somebody speak about it. You're not going to be able to manage all those different types of species. And cover crop credits. We do a lot of studies with universities. I work with UGA, NC State. We were part of a SARE grant that covered 14 states. And one of the cool things that we found about that is, like from Richmond, Virginia south, where I farm at, our zones, we only need 5 pounds of vetch to get maximum nitrogen nodulation from that vetch. Where when you start getting up into Pennsylvania, the lower parts of Michigan, it goes up to about 15 pounds. So our seeding rates are definitely going to be different based on what you want to see as an outcome. But these are the credits that we're taking for these legumes. The reason we can say this is because we solid seeded those and actually test for that on our farm to see how much each one of these were individually doing. This was not inside of a blend or a mix, but it was at the same rates that we use in our mixes. And then talking about cover crop nutrient release, if you do send a sample to Lance's lab, what we take a credit for each year and what we've seen in actual testing and breakdown is 60% of the nitrogen in that residue at that 40-to-1, and then 70% on P and 70% on K. And if your carbon to nitrogen ratio goes up, you'll see a little bit less. If your carbon to nitrogen ratio is lower, you would obviously see a little bit more as well. And then organic matter breakdown. Lance says, if you're breaking down organic matter, you're essentially destroying the house. But it's a constant cycle on our farm. And we see organic matter go down in season, and then it goes up at the end of the season with harvest and cover crop establishment. But every percent of organic matter, we're taking a credit of roughly about 20 pounds of nitrogen, 7 on phosphorus, and usually 2 on sulfur. So this is a picture of some of our check strips. Essentially, we have a cover crop mix on this side, our nice check strip where we grow, lots of winter weeds and issues that we're fighting as farmers, and then cover crop on the other side. This check strip actually used to run the other direction, and my landlord said she was tired of looking at the ugly weeds, so we had to turn it into field. Now, just remember, so we're standing here in the field. You can see the gate down here. This is what it looks like in season. So that gate is right down here as well. So this is actually the first farm that we did not use chemicals on. I'm not organic. I use chemicals if I need them. My DC just happened to be brave enough to talk me into not spraying a burn down on this field because we had such a good cover crop residue that we had rolled down. And he just said, listen, worst case scenario, you have to go do a rescue spray early in the season and kill everything if it comes through. I'm glad we didn't because, Johnson grass, pigweed, morning glory, cuckleburr, I could just start naming them all, that we've seen a great reduction in our weed issues on these farms that we're using cover crops on. And this is just a picture of what it looks like going down the road. Obviously, if you're up here in Michigan, you're probably not going to be growing stuff this tall consistently every year, but it's really worked out for us on pushing planting date back a little bit, and we've shortened up our maturity on varieties on both corn and beans on some of our acres to try to get these systems in the right direction. And so I really try to study our crops. We look at critical daylight and a bunch of different factors in picking our soybean varieties. This is my pickup truck hood. We typically yielded about 30 to 40 bushels an acre when we started farming some of this ground. As we get into this system about 5 or 6 years and we really start seeing that biological activity increase and also our water holding capacity, we start seeing, soybean yields creep up into the 60s, then the 80s. This was one of our 2 soybean yield farms this year that we entered into our yield contest. You can see we stacked nodes pretty good. We didn't abort very many of our pods that we actually set on the bean plant. Right at harvest time, we called extension, and they sent 2 extension agents out to do our measurement on our bean yield. Now, to give you an idea, these beans are about this tall. I call soybeans peasant peas. I hate picking them. I would much rather pick corn, but they came out, measured off our plot, flagged it off, and so this year we actually set a new state yield record with 117.1 bushels dry land. One of the things you don't see a lot of people that enter yield contests in, like we don't really do this for the yield, but I do want to know how hard we can drive a healthy soil system. I will share this with y'all. This is our total production on that farm. We did 1137.0 with 32% with thiosulfate 2x2 on the planter. That total would have been roughly 10 gallons to the acre. We came back at 3rd, 4th trifolia. We did our tissue sampling. We had a minor deficiency. We did sugar with a micropack and some foliar fertilizer. We did that again right at R1, and that's the first time that we actually broadcast any fertilizer. Just because you have healthy soils, agronomy does not go out the window. So we know that it takes 6 units of nitrogen to make a bushel of beans. We saw enough pod set that we were going to see a yield higher than what the soybean could actually provide that nitrogen for. And so we did supplement Simtrex, which is what we supplement AMS with. It's a sulfur product. And then we actually put about 50 pounds of urea and a little bit of potassium out at that R1 time. And so then we started looking at sugars. Was it you that was up here on the panel at first? Was it one of the guys in the front here? Were you on the panel at first? So I'll still use an insecticide if I have to. We just haven't had to spray it in about 5 or 6 years. And the way we got away with that is Dr. Jonathan Lundgren has Blue Dasher Farms. I ran into him in Kansas. He's so smart he will make your head hurt. He described us about Brix testing in plants. And if we can get a Brix level above 14, then we don't have to spray insecticides, because if a pest does bite that plant, they can't process those complex sugars. They'll bite it, they'll bloat, and they'll leave it. It also changes the way that bugs see the plant through infrared, because we do get a higher rate of photosynthesis, and it actually helps to deter them that way. Yeah, it's the sugar's just too complex. So we do a half a pound of sugar at planting time in furrow. On soybeans, we'll spray anywhere from about a half a pound to a pound per acre. It costs us about 25 to 50 cents an acre to do that. We also see a pretty nice yield bump most of the time. Probably 75% of the time we'll see a 4 to 6 bushel increase on our soybean yields. And this is just a picture of where we were picking out our planter monitor, where our plots were. And so this gives you an idea of what our Brix looks like in that soybean field. Where we had a check, we were about 5.2. Where we put molasses out, it was about 15.6. And where we did our cold process and our regular sugar, we were getting up about 34. And it really does depend on the plant. So I figured nobody in Michigan grew cotton, so I took our cotton plot out of this. But cotton actually did the complete opposite. It actually was the best with molasses. And so talking about corn production, where I'm at. This is a model system. This is heavy applied manures, no-till, good farmer in our area. And if you can see, there's essentially like a 60-foot tree line that divides my field from his field. And we no-tilled this farm. This was part of our study. And we went into some really dry times. About 60 to 70 days we didn't receive rainfall. Temperatures outside were 100, heat index about 110, 120. You can see what his corn crop looked like. The ground temperatures that day on bare no-till ground were about 94 degrees, 2 inches deep, and this is about 10 o'clock in the morning. It got hotter than this throughout the day. And this is what their corn looked like on that. I mean, 5 to 9 bushel corn. That heat ate its lunch up come pollination time. I learned another, those learning valuable lessons in farming. They went out and baled all these corn stalks and fed them to cows, and you couldn't walk 6 feet behind them without getting painted. So this is what we look like planting on the other side of the trees. We used to spray cover crops and kill them dead and then roll them down with a cultipacker. We've used 6-inch wooden posts just hung on the front of a planter before. We then went to a farm show, and there was a Yetter dealer there that had some of these stalk devastators on like a 2x2 display bar. And I asked the guy, I was like, hey, I'd like to get 3 of those. He said, what kind of corn header do you have? And I said, it's a John Deere 7000 corn planter. He looked at me like I had 3 heads, like, what are you going to do with that? We mounted it right up. I think we've been across 6,000 to 7,000 acres with those, and besides some bearings, they've wore out pretty good. This is what our corn crop looked like coming up and all that biomass and that residue. Same day, when we took the temperature measurement of our neighbors, we were about 77, they were at 94. And this is what our corn crop looked like. Our county average on corn is about 110 bushels to the acre given the year. We typically range anywhere from about 180 to about 215. We do have farms that do better than that, but that's pretty much where our averages range at. And I mean, I'm not a short guy, but I mean, 14, 15 foot tall corn is usually pretty good for us. So part of this plot on your left is no-till with just conventional fertilizer or chicken litter. This over here was in a 7-way cover crop mix. Some people preach that you have to have livestock integration to make this system work. You don't. Will you see a benefit from it? Yes. I mean, we've seen ground get turned around faster with it, but you don't have to have the livestock integration. I would say 2/3 of my landlords that we rent from, they don't want cows. They don't want the liability. They don't want to have to deal with the headache. So a lot of our ground doesn't see livestock integration. It just so happened for this study, it was one of the farms that did have it behind a cover crop mix. And that's the difference we see. Typically our test weight on our corn started in 56 to 58 pounds. As we see microbial activity increase, as we see all the benefits of what we're doing, we'll start seeing it get up into that 62, 64. 1 year we had a variety that actually made a 65-pound test weight. That was the first year we broke 300 bushels. So this is my big farmer talk for the day. Data is only good as you understand it. Lance can make the best soil sample in the world. Any other lab can make the best soil sample in the world. But if you can't read it and interpret the data to where we make a management decision, what did we really get from it? So this is where we started. We started pulling our samples in 2011 when we picked up our first farm. They went to NCDA and they went to Waters Laboratory. We used that until 2013 when I was introduced to Rick Haney for the first time. We believed in the Haney test. We saw the results from the Haney test, but it took me 4 years to implement this test over my whole operation. We did it in 25% increments because that was manageable. And to this day, I still pull Mealic 3. I still pull a Mealic 3 and compare what the Haney test says to my Mealic 3 test, and I've got that data for the last 10 years now. And so, how many of you farm in here? I'm going to make y'all work. Make sure you're awake. All right. I'm going to pick on some people. How deep do you pull your soil samples? 6 to 8 inches. We need one more. Anybody else? Who pulls your own soil samples? 6 to 8 inches. 6 to 8? 6 to 8. So in North Carolina, NCDA told us if we no-tilled, pull 4 inches. If we did any kind of tillage, 6 to 8. How many of you farm a flower pot? I haven't found anybody yet. I don't. So they told me 4 inches. That's really good when it comes to fertilizer recommendations if you're the man selling the fertilizer. So let's look at potassium. So 0 to 4, we had 156 pounds. From 4 to 8, we had roughly another 45, and from 8 to 12, we had another 55. So that means for me going and applying 100 pounds of potassium on a fertilizer recommendation just by going that extra 8 inches deep, which my corn roots go down 3-4 feet deep, really the only time you have that limiting factor is if your water table's high. This is where we're at now. We don't have to apply that. Same thing with sulfur, 24 pounds in the top 4 inches, then 31 pounds from 4 to 8, 57 pounds from 8 to 12. Those are 2 of our biggest fertilizers that we were applying on our farms that are gone because nutrient cycling, breakdown of organic matter, those cover crop roots going deeper in the soil profile, they pull it back up, and then that decaying cover crops also are releasing these nutrients. So we're keeping them in that root zone. So then NC State wanted to prove me wrong. I have a really bad love-hate relationship with our agronomy department. I called them in 2014 to ask them when our state lab would run the Haney test. They haven't called me back yet. So all of these are no-till with cover crops and our soil systems that we use the Haney test on except for plot number 2. So the state test with no fertilizer, about 80 bushels. We put 50 pounds of fertilizer on. We went up to about 125. Put on another 50 pounds, we hit about 160. Another 50 pounds, we were hitting that 180 mark. I mean, that clearly shows me right there that that system is actually pretty much addicted to a fertilizer. And what really got me is when I was showing this to Rick Haney, he was like, hey man, what about this over here on the left? What about the 3 different plots in that same field that had no nitrogen applied to it at all? And yes, it is variable, but these were different cover crop mixtures, but we hit 130, 155, and 180. So with no nitrogen at all, I hit the same as what their plot did with 150 units of nitrogen. I mean, somebody told me y'all were almost $2 a unit for nitrogen up here. Like, how bad are y'all up here in Michigan right now? Not good? That's all you need to know, not good? Anyways, even if it was $1 a bushel, you're talking about $150 an acre in savings. And so that's where, me as a farmer, the first time I met Lance, the first time I met Rick Haney, and I heard the whole spiel about how it rains water and it doesn't rain meal at 3, it just made sense. So this is what we look at. You're either going to do KCl or you're going to do nitrate with a current lab. This is what all the Haney test does, these 9 different ways that we're taking a credit for additional nitrogen pools that we're not getting in university testing. And then this comes up to last week. I hope y'all share this video all across the country because I'm gonna poke a scab. So we did a nutrient management school in North Carolina 2 days last week. Our head of our soils and crops department for our state extension sent out an email privately to about 1,500 people and said that the Haney test wasn't calibrated or correlated to North Carolina soils. And she said it didn't make crop recommendations. I actually took my daughter's red crayon, circled the red crayon around the crop recommendations, posted it on Facebook, and I said, if you can't see this makes a crop recommendation, you don't know what you're talking about. So they sent me this. This is how our test was calibrated. I mean, does that look very calibrated to you that we apply 0 units of nitrogen and we make 50 bushels to 170? I mean, this one right here was from up in North Dakota. That's the calibration of their soil test. Somebody shot the side of a barn with a shotgun, drew a line through it, and said, there we go. This is your magical number. I'm not knocking on them, but me as a farmer, I'm putting my hard-earned dollars and money into buying fertility, putting a crop in the ground, managing that crop, and still trying to make money at it while everybody thinks that I'm trying to kill them. Fight the battles that you think you can win. I can win that battle all day long. So it goes back to the Haney test. Biological indicators. Soil respiration. Can I walk? Will that? Okay. So we look at soil respiration. That's our biggest one we look at. You can see, like Lance was talking about, this farm started with a respiration of about 70 to 80. After 10 years now, we're up into the 400, 500s. That's a massive increase. And then we also look at water extractable carbon, or organic carbon, which is the one right beside of it. Those are the two first things I look at on a test. It tells me how that ground is performing. Then we start looking at soil organic matter. This farm started with about a 1.5, 1.6% organic matter. We're up to about 7.5 to 7.8. It's just something, this is one of the farms we've really pushed the hardest. And then one of the big key takeaways, I didn't even get to tell you about this. So down here at the bottom, it gives you this like handy little nitrogen credit. So on the Haney test, on our 0 to 6, we saw 69.2 pounds of nitrogen that we wouldn't have gotten in a traditional test. And then in the 6 to 12, we got another 61 pounds of nitrogen. That's 130 pounds of nitrogen over 48 acres of this farm. It cost me $2.20 an acre to run this test. I'm going to save $183 an acre in nitrogen this year, based at $1.40 a unit. I'm good with that all day. That's easy return on investment. Then we started looking at the regenerative certified testing. We had 100 different farmers at a conference that we asked them, well, what is regenerative agriculture? 2 simple words. And it was different between all 100 farmers. And there's nothing wrong with that, but a lot of the food companies that have been calling us and calling Lance and wanting to know, how do we get a hold of regenerative farmers? What does that actually mean? Most of the time, if somebody says it and they give you a nice little label like organic, it's usually an opinion. There's nothing scientific to back it up. So Rick and Lance worked to look at all these different indicators on this soil test to look at what's better in the 0 to 6 than the 6 to 12. And this was one of them. Looking at that nitrogen pool, we're picking up this additional organic side in red versus what we saw on the blue. And so we actually ran this test on our farm last year. We had a farm that we had picked up. It's only been in our practices for a couple years, so I mean, it's not something we thought was going to be a great farm, but I really thought it would actually pass. I will tell you, my pride was hurt a little bit. This one failed. So it's not always, the greatest outcome. But if you see that little red dot, I mean, we didn't miss the mark by much, but this farm failed. I can then take those Haney tests and look at the indicators, and I can change cover crop mixes. I can try to introduce livestock. I can try to have a different rotation with my cover crop. I mean, there's so many management decisions that we can make based upon this test to get that ground where we want it to above that line. And so this is where we were at. The corn on your right had 250 units of nitrogen, which is what our state lab recommended. The one in the middle had 125, which was about a half rate. That's what the state came up with that they wanted us to do. On the Haney test, we were shooting for 200 bushel corn. The Haney test recommended no nitrogen on this crop. We actually put none, and this is what our 0 nitrogen looked like. I mean, that's a massive yield difference there, guys. Man, nobody got that joke. Y'all are falling asleep on me. We're literally talking about maybe a kernel round and maybe 1 or 2 tall. So they came out. This is Teresa riding in our combine for our plots. We picked our plots, and this is what we came out with. Our full rate of nitrogen at 250 pounds made 198 bushels. Where we cut the nitrogen in half down to 125, we picked 193. We lost 5 bushels, cutting the nitrogen in half. We put no nitrogen on it at all, and we picked 189 bushels. I lost 9 bushels in yield and cut 250 units of nitrogen out. So at $1, anybody got a calculator? I'm going to make y'all work. Make sure. Hey, you got your phone out. You got a calculator on there? He's busy. He's working. What's 250 times $1.40? $350. So during this growing season, that's $350 an acre in differences for $36 in yield. So even if we take $7 corn right now and multiply it by 9 bushels, we're talking what? $36? 45? So would you rather spend $350 to make 45 more? Doesn't make sense. So even though we do get some really good yields, our farm motto is we farm for profit, not for yield. We look at ROI. So not post-spraying our corn, not post-spraying our beans. Our chemical savings last year was about $22,400. Just looking at N, P, and K, just the big three, based on the Haney test, we saved right at about $80,000 last year on nutrients. Our total savings on NPK and chemicals last year with our practices was a little over $100,000. So Gabe Brown loves to tell you about his cocktails, and David Brandt loves to tell you about his radishes. I like talking about corn. Half of y'all are still awake. So we got to picking our corn plot, and we called the extension again. They came out. This is Durr. This is actually Lee's wife. They've been married since we took this picture. We ended up with 318.15 bushels dry land. That was 120 units of nitrogen applied, a little bit of sulfur, and about 5 gallons of 1137O. Now, once again, I'm not telling you we made this on 120 units of nitrogen. Agronomy doesn't go out the window. It's 1 to 1.3 units of nitrogen, depending on what state or university you're around, that it takes to grow a bushel of corn. What I'm telling you is based on the Haney test, based on that cover crop residue test, based on our in-season test, our tissue testing, we knew how much nitrogen we needed to put on and how much we could cut back on, and it only called for about 120. It's that easy, right? Not really. So how many of you grow corn? Make sure you're still awake. How many of you pull stock nitrate samples? Got one. This right here is your report card at the end of the season. Costs $10, $15 to run this test, but I'm basing my nitrogen needs this year also based on this test. It's an easy thing to do. I wait till black layer, I give it 10 days, I go pull my samples. We try to do it the same time frame every year so we get consistent results. Because even where we only put 120 units of nitrogen, we were still excessive. Water is my limiting factor. I've never had irrigation. I got some irrigation equipment delivered about 4 weeks ago. We'll see what we can do with some water this year. Never had it. It's either going to be fun or I'm going to hate it. It's what everybody keeps telling me. Then we started looking at 60-inch corn. How many cow guys we got in the room? I didn't really go a lot into livestock. We started looking at 60-inch corn. Lauren Steinloggy in Iowa, Mitchell in Iowa, all these guys that I travel with and get to speak with, we all tell each other privately the crazy things we're doing so nobody can make fun of us. So we did 60-inch corn versus 30s. And the 60-inch corn is on your left, and the 30-inch corn is on your right. 30-inch corn was planted at 32,000. 60-inch corn, we couldn't get the corn planter to put any more than 59,800. And all we did was shut every other row off. So in Iowa, more colder climates, they'll go in at V4, V5. They'll overseed a summer cover crop mix. You can graze it if you have livestock. If not, you're doing some great things for your soil biology. The summer cover crops will put about 80% of their energy back into the soil profile versus the winter cover crops only putting about 40 to 50%. I have cows, so we came in here at tassel and we actually seeded our cover crop at tassel because I have such a longer growing season. When we got to harvest, we harvested this corn, did a biomass check, and just the cover crop, we had 8,800 pounds of forage for those cows to eat. That's day one putting cows on that ground. We sell our cows on Facebook. We direct market them. We get $5 a pound. We're seeing about 2 pounds a day gain. That's $10 for every cow we put out there. We were making about $150 a day just on having 10 cows graze around this farm. We also make bourbon. As y'all saw here, this is our new label. We started with Foothills. We've started another distillery called Farmers Reserve, but we started looking at value added. Doesn't matter if the economy's up or down. If fertilizer prices go up, it seems like a lot of bush lattes get bought by farmers and also bourbon. Got a few on that one. So we've started working with beer production on our farm. This is some of our vertical integration. This is what our bottle looks like for Farmers Reserve Distillery. Rick Haney retired last year, and we kind of our little group of farmers, we call them the Legends, so we named this one the Bourbon of Legends. It was made for him. We also started looking at verifications. This is a little bit that Lance talked about earlier with certified. So a lot of the food companies wanted to know how they could come up with a label. that would be used for regenerative products. Regenerative verified we use for grains or commodities. Regeneratively grown is for any protein based. Essentially, a farmer gets entered into the system. We have a third-party sampling company pull their soil samples and send them to Lance's lab. If it passes regenerative certification, we run them through the verification, which is nothing more than, are you using a single regenerative practice? We don't put a restriction on using a certain number, or you can't use this or you can't use that. Now, if you're only doing one regenerative practice, and you're doing a bunch of bad practices on top of that, you're probably not going to pass the test. If you're doing at least a few of them and you're practicing soil health principles, you're more than likely going to pass. And this is a way for us as farmers to be able to verify and actually sell our products for a premium. And like Lance says a couple times when we've talked about this, don't expect to run this test and go down to Cargill or ADM with a truckload of corn and throw this paper in front of them and say, hey, I want 25 more cents a bushel. They'll probably laugh at you and tell you to go to the hippie co-op. So this is what our label looks like on our bourbon bottle. It's pretty easy to recognize. We also call it the bacon of bourbon. It's a gateway bourbon. It's people that don't like bourbon typically drink this one and like it. This is our original bourbon. We made the first bourbon in North Carolina since Prohibition. I would say probably 70% of our corn goes into making these products, and then the rest of it we may use on the farm for feed or seed. And so here's the biggest thing I have to say. The day that we understand this as farmers is the day that everything changes. It seems like so many farmers that are in the regenerative side or the soil health side, we share each other's stories, we share successes and failures. The biggest thing that I can tell you is this is kind of my group of people that have really mentored me in my way in farming. If it wasn't for these people, I wouldn't be up here in front of y'all today. I mean, I've only been talking, really farming. This will be my 10th crop coming up. But having each one of these individual people share their stories, share their knowledge and information really has got us to the point that we're at today. And so that's been pretty key for our success. And now we're into questions. I actually tried to take a few out, so I made sure we had time. So unless I put everybody to sleep, if you've got any questions, production questions, anything that we've talked about, now's a good time.
There was while you were talking, but now I forgot it.
Now you forgot them? Go ahead.
With the devastators on the front of the planter, do you have to wait for anthesis on that cereal rye, or can you get a little bit sooner? Do you got to wait a little bit longer?
So the question was, with the devastators, do we have to wait till anthesis to get the roll and the crimp? With that older style, yes. So the original ones we had just had the rebar that went across it. We've upgraded now to the chevron pattern one, and it's got that torsion bar system on it.
Is that through Yetter, or is that something?
Yeah, still through Yetter. Yeah, it's still through Yetter, but they've changed the design. Instead of the rebar like they were using on the corn headers, we've got a nice chevron pattern. It doesn't have to be as tall as that. I would say anything over about 2 feet. Once we hit about that 2 foot mark, we can see a crimp. It's better for us. Example, 2 years ago, it was dry going into planting time. I wasn't about to let cover crop get this big and soak all the moisture out of my ground. We went out there and either planted as fast as we could and sprayed with Gramoxone behind the planter, which helped kill it so quick that it stayed down. Or we went out there and sprayed ahead of time, and if it was already, turned brown and dead, when that devastator hit it, it pretty much decimated it down to the ground. And we also found out that we could change the amount of PSI, what we were running as far as down pressure on them. And so if it was a shorter cover crop, really kind of almost beating it pretty hard, really kept keeping it down to the ground as well. Y'all got to have more than one question. Y'all can't be that tired. Somebody wants bourbon.
How do you come up with the ratio of cover soil, like rye, like 70 to 1 carbon and nitrogen? How do you balance that to get it down to 40 to 1? Like, what's the formula to, you put in clovers or vetch to get it down, but how do you know how much per pound you should go?
So the way that we balance the carbon to nitrogen ratio is, say, cereal rye at 6 inches tall. A solid stand of cereal rye at 6 inches, you're probably looking at like 10 to 1. So not very bad at all. By the time you're getting 28 inches of height on that, you're probably already pushing that 50 to 1. The way we balance it out, Keith Burns has the Smart Seed calculator. And it actually works better for y'all's area than what it does mine. It doesn't really correlate that deep south. but you can go to the cover crop calculator that they've got on their website, and you put in how many pounds of cereal rye, triticale, oats, or then you add in your vetch and everything else, and they'll actually put in there what it should be at different heights. NRCS does have some pretty good paperwork on cover crop seed maturities and where they're at as well. So if you want to like longhand it and not use something that's already available, you can go out and longhand it with that NRCS form, which is what we did the first couple of years. And then once you get into this system, you kind of get an idea for it. I mean, I still do this testing on some of our farms consistently every year because we talk about it and we share that information. But I don't have to do this every year now. Like I can go out there and see with my eyes, hey, this cover crop residue is this tall, this is the mixture in this field. And after doing this for a few years, you can kind of get away from needing as much help in those systems.
So is there an advantage to using like we've been doing cereal rye in front of soybeans. Is it still good to put in legumes to bring that nitrogen carbon ratio down?
Depends on who you ask. I was told about the green bridge effect, about nematodes. I was told about armyworms, cutworms. Literally, I mean, you would have imagined a U-Haul of worms traveling down from farm to farm, destroying crops if you planted a legume before a soybean. I plant vetch, crimson clover, winter peas. I'll plant all of those before beans because soybeans are only going to nodulate about 300 pounds. And that's if they do nodulate well. Well, that's only enough for me to hit 50 bushels. I want to go past that. So I've either got to supplement that with synthetic fertilizer or I have to build that through legumes and organic matter breakdown. Once again, what I talked about in the beginning, do a check strip. You know, if your header's 60 foot, do some 60-foot strips and replicate them across the field. You'll see it at fall with your yield monitor. I mean, you're essentially gambling potentially yield and whatever the cover crop seed costs you, but if you're picking up 10 bushel beans and they're 14, 15 bucks right now, that greatly offsets the cost of that cover crop. But I can't tell you exactly what's going to work on your farm in Michigan, but I can tell you how to try it.
Find any connection between the flavor of the bourbon and your practices or your variety?
Yes. So the question was, do we see any changes in the flavor of the bourbon with variety or practices? We grow Bloody Butcher corn from like the early 1800s. Best bourbon I've ever had in my life. We call it Butcher's Bourbon. We've had that stuff barreled for about 6 years, and I would say that me and Zach have sampled probably close to a barrel in that 6-year time frame. It's quality control. I don't drink bourbon straight, but I will drink this one and that Butcher's Bourbon straight. Variety, the older heirloom varieties, we started grinding them up into grits and cornmeal, and people went nuts over the older varieties because they're just so much more flavorful. We see higher protein counts. I didn't really put a lot of that in there because, you know, I wasn't sure how many people we had that did feed. But these older heirloom varieties, we see 12, 13% crude protein versus like hybrids, we're seeing 8s and 9s. But yeah, it does affect. And then there's HFCs, which even some of the seed corn companies started putting it in their books. If you see a HFC variety, I can tell you that it'll make about 10 to 15% more alcohol per run with a highly fermentable corn than what you would see in just a multi-purpose variety. So yeah, we do look at genetics and different varieties for different flavors.
You talked about the butchered corn meaning open pollinated, correct?
It is open pollinated.
Okay. With the cover crop ratio, are you noticing the 1/4 inch by 2 inch earworms, or have you gotten away from that because of the cover crops? Because that's what I see on the open pollinated.
So we have slugs, huh? Oh, so the question is with the open pollinated corn, are we seeing, was it earworms?
Yeah.
Are we having earworm issues with the open pollinated corn versus if we were using a traded variety?
What cover crop relief are you seeing in that? Because you said you don't have to spray with using cover crops, so.
I didn't say we didn't have to spray. I said I hadn't had to spray. I've got a chemical shed full of fungicide, bifenthrin. I mean, you name it, we've got it. We scout. If it came down to the difference between me having a crop and me losing a crop based on using an insecticide, I'm gonna spray that crop all day long. That's just good management. What we have seen is as Brix levels increase, and as we spray less, we see more beneficials than we see predators, and there's an offset. Point in case, when I harvest soybeans, I don't know about in Michigan, I have an 8-year-old daughter. She refuses to go into a soybean field the next day because they will make one continuous spider web completely across that field. As you know, root worms were an issue for us, and a buddy of mine actually took a video in the field where we saw this root worm in the residue, and the corn's probably about this tall, and we were like, man, we got worms. Like, we're gonna have to spray for this, and that worm was moving around real weird. You know, a spider had it and was taking care of it. We've seen ladybugs come in. When we see the ladybugs, we don't have as many aphids. I have the same issues that every other farmer does, but we either use a natural system if we can. We also see the beneficials outweigh the predators, and if that doesn't work, I'll go spray it. But we do threshold counts for stink bugs. And y'all have kudzu bugs up here? If you don't, I'll ship you some. Our state thought it was a great idea to bring kudzu bugs in because of the kudzu issue in our state. The only thing that they forgot is the number one thing that they love other than kudzu are soybean plants about this big, and the soybeans come out before the kudzu. So the first couple of years we had a really bad problem with that. So yeah, I mean, we still have pest issues, and I still get disease. If we plant extremely late in the season and a hurricane comes through, it's bringing southern rust up from Georgia. I mean, we already know that's going to be a problem.
Are you seeing an increase in your corn yields with the higher Brix numbers?
I've never correlated it to Brix.
I've heard of a lot of guys putting Brix down on soybeans, added sugars and everything, and increasing yields, but I'm wondering if it worked kind of the same thing on corn.
So we spray corn, so we get so much vegetation growth with corn that we spray a pound. If we're going across the field, it gets a pound because it's going to eat that Brix up as soon as that plant's going through pretty much V2 to be, going into R1. We've never correlated our yield to our Brix levels, but over time, when we've seen healthier soils, we naturally see those Brix going up before we apply the sugar, and we see yields go up. I mean, first year we farmed more than the single farm. I think our farm average was like 140 bushels, which was still a little bit better than our county average. But 10 years into this, to have a 180 to about 215, I think our highest corn yield yet, we had one farm, complete farm average like 360. I'll go ahead and tell you it may be a complete failure, but the whole reason I bought irrigation equipment is nobody in our state's made 400 bushel corn yet, and I did a 360 dry land. I'm hoping to add like 80 bushels, and it was kind of like a side bet made. If I do that, I might try to get a tractor off of a buddy of mine. He said I couldn't do it. I still have to pay him for it, but he said he'd sell it if I hit it. But we're trying to see, but that's not a kitchen sink approach. Like, I'm not going to go out there and make 50 passes and put drip tape down and pump 32% nitrogen. We're simply looking at water has always been our limiting factor on our farm, and if I can supplement that water along with these soil health principles that we're practicing, where's our plateau going to be?
What about voles and corn or beans? Have you had any issues with that?
Voles, yes. If we plant corn into cover crops, we make sure that those cover crops are as flat as they can be on the ground. You can almost pick to the row. One year we planted, and we were like, hey, we're going to leave this 5 acres unrolled just to see what happens. Those voles would start on one end of the field, and they would run that entire row eating those corn. I mean, you could tell it down to the row which end they started on and where they stopped at. So we've had vole issues. Soybeans, they're not that bad. Corn gets leggy. If you don't get that cover crop residue down, that corn will try to grow as tall as it can to get to sunlight, and then it just looks horrible. Turns yellow. It's got a spindly stalk. I didn't like that. Soybeans, on the other hand, I'll plant into them with a drill. We essentially spray it with Gramoxone. Usually we'll put a residual with it if our cover crop stand isn't real thick. But within about a month, after that cover crop's good and brown and dead, you get enough windstorms and storms roll through that the rest of that cover crop's on the ground, and beans are starting to get towards canopy at that point. Well, listen, if any of y'all happen to think of any more questions, I'll be around for the rest of the day, and I appreciate y'all's time. Thank you.